Monster High is a doll line, and also a movie franchise, a game, a series of short webisodes, and a series of novels, all manufactured to promote and sell a brand. It is also the last remnant of true artistic proclivity on this godforsaken apocalyptic wasteland we call a planet. You might know Monster High as those dolls that you were always too afraid to ask your parents for, but nonetheless fascinated you with their alluring, confusingly aged nature, and as the blossoming beginnings of your lifelong relationship with gender nonconformity and vampire erotica. Or perhaps you were not like the other girls, as the kids say, far too preoccupied with high-octane musings of pizza and Netflix to indulge in such primitive and shallow feminine fantasies, in which case you probably know them as another dystopian tyrannical symbol of girly stuff, and we all applaud you for your stunning and revolutionary individuality. I am a transvestite autogynephile deviant crossdresser, so I was very much enamored with girly stuff growing up, and Monster High holds a particularly special place in my heart and makes me feel very represented on account of every character looking like an undead drag queen. Hello and welcome. I am what some would describe as a female impersonator, even when all I'm successfully impersonating is a whitewashed Brandon Rogers character. Today specifically, I would like to focus on one specific movie in the Monster High franchise, whose uncanny 3D animation characterizes it as a part of Gen 1, aka the era that we're all tragically overhyping due to petty nostalgia, and the era that is a dilapidated symbol of simpler times slipped through your fingers and statistically at least a few of your gay awakenings. Growing up as a queer kid, I always found myself very enthralled with Monster High as a franchise, but only from a distance. I was fascinated by the few glimpses I caught over the shoulders of my friends of any fashion doll line, but the bold and alternative characters within the Monster High universe particularly stood out. This fascination was always something I kept to myself, despite growing up with parents who 100% would not have given a fuck if I asked for one as a birthday present. A part of me was always aware that the bold, unapologetic, campy femininity that I loved so much was something that my peers found embarrassing and cringy. It was only until much later in my life, once Generation 1 and 2 were both officially over, that I started to allow myself to really get into the Monster High franchise. Being absolutely not the target audience for something I've grown to love this much has its pros and cons. On the one hand, it can and has been reasonably argued that watching animated baby movies from the 2010s as a young adult and crying in an attempt to regain the childhood you were too afraid to let yourself have is significantly more embarrassing than being a vaguely boy-adjacent child who didn't suppress their, at the time, age-appropriate interests and just asked their parents for a fucking doll. On the other hand, an older person's perspective allows me to look at the franchise through my special nuance glasses, that's these, and make the unsubstantiated claim that Monster High was actually a highly genius, neo-Marxist, postmodern, transhuman, feminist, theoretical, vegan, fucking society bully, socialism, eat the rich, text of immense value the whole time, because overanalyzing is my one and only skill. Monster High is far from without flaw, but for the time it was introduced, and even to this day, there are certain aspects of its premise that could very easily be considered radical within the toy industry and the world of children's entertainment. Foremostly, the Monster High brand stands out in its catering towards the pre-existing interests observed in its target demographic, rather than basing its marketing and premise off the ideas of adults, and attempting to dictate subliminally what kids should find appealing. Garrett Sander, the initial creator of the brand, reported that his ideas were informed by his observations of young girls around 7 to 14, and where they were more likely to shop. He recalls in interviews being surprised at the number of young girls who were very interested in alternative fashion subcultures, noticing that if given the choice, a large majority of kids were choosing to rebel against the system and live out their Hot Topic fantasy, contrary to the pure and overly sanitized aesthetics most commonly sold to children. Particularly girls. Sander saw an untapped market here and sought to create a doll line that catered explicitly to edgier, weirder kids with the launch of Monster High in 2010. Despite the immense backlash, this worked, and Monster High became the second most popular doll line for a number of years, failing to surpass only the merciless overlord of the fashion doll industry, Barbie herself. Monster High was always a brand that preached diversity and inclusivity in the kind of vague, liberal, uncommitted way that any megacorporation would, emphasizing the fun in things we might otherwise find scary or weird. And while they never really did much to practice what they preached, after all, genuine inclusivity in a cast of characters is seen as not profitable, the premise of the entire line has all kinds of subtle and not so subtle queer coding to it. It's no secret that the queer community has historically had a significant relationship with horror genre. During the implementation of the Hays Code, after 1934, openly queer cinema became overtly criminalized, and as a result of this, our only option was the legal loophole of portraying queerness and queer stories in ways that would not be seen as glorifying or encouraging it, because it was seen as a sinful lifestyle. Essentially, you could get away with a lot more homoerotic subtext if it was played as scary. There is often a clear distinction between a cishet director appropriating queer signals without much thought as cheap scares, and a queer person attempting to tell a queer story without censorship to the best of their abilities. But both of these trends were very much developing side by side in the same time period, as a semi-direct result of the Hays Code. In a time where fear-mongering around AIDS and the stereotype of predatory queer men and trans women was absolutely thriving, it was easy for directors to use queer signals as cheap spooks for the audience, further cementing queerness as immoral and deviant in people's minds. If you're queer, you'll probably recognize this as the reason so many modern villains today are portrayed as off-putting through traits like an effeminate manner of speaking or dressing, or by acting overly familiar or even flirtatious with the masculine heterosexual hero character. Because of this era, to this day, this is just what we associate with villain characters, and it's become a well-recognized trope. Where I find this phenomenon of queer villains the most interesting, though, is when it manifests in non-human characters. For a queer writer, shedding the restraints of writing about an exclusively human cast can open the doors to far more complex metaphorical exploration of the queer experience, and in many cases provide the freedom to tell much more sympathetic stories. As a fictional monster is not seen as a figure warranting imitation in the general public, the way a portrayal of two human men kissing is, we could get away with a lot more. Without the threat of encouraging straight audiences to follow in the footsteps of on-screen characters, enforcers of the Hays Code were much more lenient on queer-coded stories if they centered around a character that was wholly horrific and undesirable, and that seemingly no one would want to imitate. In this way, writers and directors were able to explore ideas and experiences like complete ostracization from society, being treated with dehumanization and fear, unrequited or forbidden love, liberating oneself from the confines of respectable straight society, and whatever other queer experiences they wanted that weren't explicitly gay sex. Yes, this is still about Monster High. With all that probably unnecessary context in mind, it's understandable that queer people would gravitate towards a brand that's essentially those familiar classic horror monsters, but if they were killed, disemboweled, preserved in a block of bargain bin glitter gel for 10 years, and then resurrected in the dead of night by a goth Britney Spears. The particular text I want to use as a case study for Monster High's pretty consistent queer coding is the animated movie Haunted. This film graced the earth with its presence on the 24th of March 2015, and made young girls everywhere confront their dormant fascination with lesbian pirates. The movie opens on a scene that immediately introduces its main cast, Draculaura, Claudine, Rochelle, Spectra, Serena, and Twyla. Apparently they decided Frankie can get fucked for this movie. The film immediately establishes a primary conflict. Spectra is struggling in her search for a story to further her career as an accomplished girl blogger, a challenge I'm sure we can all relate to. She is panicking very proportionally after all her career as a revered teenage influencer is severely at stake. Luckily, the same scene also introduces us to a potential solution. Claudine, being the committed friend and best overall character that she is, comforts Spectra and assures her that she will help find a story. They sure did establish a dynamic between these characters ripe for exploration. It would make a lot of sense if she ended up being the primary support for Spectra's character growth and wasn't sidelined for a completely random male character for the sake of shoehorned compulsory heterosexuality. Wouldn't it? I'm great at foreshadowing, and my bones are sizzling. After establishing Spectra's desperation and communicating to the audience that she is both energetic and committed to her journalism, as well as significantly naive and reliant on input from her peers, we cut to her approaching the assigned mean girl, cliché, and resident camp queen Toralei Stripe, who claims to have a story. Even when unfamiliar with the Monster High franchise, we can clearly tell she is unambiguously evil, as she introduces herself by complaining that she's being punished for cheating on an essay, and this is a kids' movie from 2015.
You cheat on one essay in creative writing class and you get suspended from Fear Squad for an entire month!
Also, she has what can only be described as a gayer version of a Karen haircut. Despite this, Spectra's excitement at the prospect of new content causes her to immediately rejoice and take whatever Toralei has just told her completely at face value. She is a pawn complicit in the online grifter space and is not immune to propaganda. Immediately we learn that Toralei's story is that there was an outbreak among the werewolves at Monster High of something called werefleas, a lie she created specifically to maliciously target Claudine, and a rumor that's believability is reliant on the ignorance of the non-werewolf students, who are unaware that this disease is fictional. Essentially, Spectra's desire for online validation has led her to being uncritically complicit in platforming racist propaganda, and discarding the genuine help offered by the friend she is affecting by doing so. A tale as old as time. Despite werefleas assumedly being something none of the characters have ever heard of, seeing as Toralei made it up, the students of Monster High immediately accept the article as truth and react by shunning the werewolves. This mirrors how malicious propaganda spreads in real life, specifically designed to target minority groups that won't have much influence on the public, and about whom widespread complete understanding is scarce. The characters believe Spectra's article because it is coming from a source they both trust and enjoy, and because it describes a phenomenon present in a group they're not a part of, and thus they don't have the perspective required to dismiss it. Wereflies can easily be considered a stand-in for any vague yet scary-sounding buzzword used in mainstream media. I said mainstream. Yes, anyway, it can easily be understood as a stand-in for any vague yet scary-sounding buzzword used in mainstream media to make certain groups look unfavorable in the real world, in the same vein as cultural Marxism, critical race theory, gender ideology, which are all phrases that often aren't applicable to the groups they're attributed to, and that most people do not understand the meaning of, but are accepted as generally bad concepts because of how they're presented. This storyline, while not being the main one, establishes themes of ignorance and bigotry, as well as the dangers of misinformation that will be further explored throughout the film. We then introduce the other initial main conflict, with Draculaura being haunted by an unidentified anonymous ghost, who introduces himself by trashing her locker for no adequately explained reason and giving her fashion advice. Notably, the ghost doesn't do anything actively malicious, they cause inconvenience, but only as a byproduct of their morally neutral ghostly activities. And yet it is clear that there is a social stigma around ghosts attaching themselves to humans that evokes at the very least some apprehension. This doesn't come in the form of concern at the fact that there is a complete stranger following Draculaura around and fucking with her, but more of the mere concept of being haunted, which is in-universe seemingly a phenomenon regarded with a significant spook factor, but without much thought given to its actual social implications. This is a kids' film. They're not exactly going to explore the intricate dynamics and socio-political conflicts inevitable in a world where these things can happen, so the characters react to the haunting on a micro scale, and the story addresses the concept exclusively around how 4 teenagers react to it, thus establishing this as the in-universe standard for reacting to hauntings, and giving us little perspective on how ghosts that haunt people are regarded generally in monster society. From what we're given, we can gather that most likely they just are considered something of a common nuisance, and are regarded less equally than ghosts who appear with a more interactable form for the sake of socializing, like Spectra, and the other ghosts at Monster High. This is reflective of a culture that values integration and compliance with an established status quo, but also of a culture that doesn't seem to worry proportionately when a 16-year-old is being essentially stalked by someone with a completely unknown identity and background. Some confusing exposition to say the least. It's almost like this is a children's movie, and holding its world building to the same standards as something made for adults is pointless. At the very least, this scene establishes a disconnect between ghost society and non-ghost society, a point that will prove very significant later on in the movie. In the next scene, we get Claudine's confrontation of Spectra about the story she published. Claudine explains the harm of blindly trusting unsourced information, and Spectra apologizes for trusting an allegorical racist over the target of said allegorical racism. Now no one will ever lie on the internet again, thank you Monster High. Claudine assures Spectra that she was serious about helping her, and that she doesn't need to seek out reactionary narratives for the sake of having content, and then our 2 storylines converge as Draculaura and her friends approach to tell them about the haunting. However, instead of reacting with enthusiasm at a potential new story, Spectra reacts with panicked disbelief, and then outright fear.
Are you okay, Spectra?
It's not possible. It can't be a haunting. That's against the rules. Don't worry, Draculaura. It won't happen again. It just won't happen again.
This lends credibility to our previously established belief that ghosts are typically quite disconnected from other monsters, and Spectra and the other ghosts are outliers in their participation in monster society. The idea of an unidentified ghost even being at Monster High is shocking to her, and clearly indicates a discrepancy in the social categories and roles she's familiar with, leading her to conclude that something is wrong. Her reaction is just as surprising to the other characters as it is to the audience, and it's clear that Spectra's presence at Monster High has always been something they took for granted as normal, which is why they previously reacted so mildly to the prospect of a new ghost. From this we can now gather that the reaction of these 4 specific teenagers to a ghost is not actually indicative of a widespread cultural narrative, and that these particular characters' perception of ghosts has been shaped by their environment and their proximity to Spectra. After Spectra flees the situation in distress, the other ghouls follow her out of concern and curiosity, and witness her fly up to an attic and unleash a big, clearly significant glowing portal thing that was apparently just covered by a sheet, and then she angelically ascends up a beam of light in a shot that either resembles divine ascension or alien abduction, depending on who you ask. Claudine, being the consistently lovely character that she is and committing to her promise to help Spectra, decides to follow her and make sure everything's okay, or at the very least provide emotional support for whatever Spectra is going through.
I promised Spectra I'd help her find a story. And whatever she's after, I'm not letting her go alone.
But we're shown that Claudine cares a lot about Spectra, and that her willingness to support her friend remains steadfast even when she's been affected negatively by Spectra's impulsiveness. Claudine's desire to help is so far unconditional, remaining unaffected by the fact that Spectra shows little to no appreciation or faith in Claudine's abilities. On the contrary, it seems that Spectra actually finds it more productive to ignore the available support of her friend and take matters into her own hands. Thus, we must ask ourselves the question, is Spectra Vondergeist a deeply troubled person plagued by her own inferiority and condemned to a life of mental isolation due to the secret political conflicts of her culture that she is burdened with keeping a secret from her closest friends, and a soul tormented by the obligation to reject the support of her loved ones out of the fear of jeopardizing the corrupt society she is trying to turn her back on? And is Claudine the forbidden love she is eternally doomed to reject the advances of due to the pressures of her culture, but who nonetheless remains there for her through all of it?
Yes.
The gals materialize on an ominous ghost ship upon a plane of fog where they encounter a new character, River Styx, who explains that she is an amateur reaper and that the boat they are on serves the purpose of carrying spirits to the ghost world. Because our girls aren't ghosts, they are only on the ship because they followed Spectra, River warns them that by being there they are definitely violating some kind of rule. After this brief piece of exposition, Spectra emerges and we can see that she's had a makeover for some reason. Her hair is far less casually styled and her outfit is different. Mattel's efforts at scrambling for any excuse to manufacture new dolls is always very obnoxious and noticeable, but here it actually provides us with a significant unspoken exposition about Spectra's relationship to the ghost world. From her change in appearance, we can tell this is something of a formal occasion to her, and that there are certain social expectations she finds it necessary to adhere to for the sake of respect from other ghosts. The noticeable formality in the change of appearance indicates there is a clear disconnect between her and the culture of the ghost world, as we can assume she does not feel comfortable presenting herself in the same way she does at Monster High, for reasons that are still unknown but are still clearly causing her a degree of distress. Spectra explains that her and all of the other ghost students at Monster High originate from the ghost world, but it's deliberately cut off from outsiders. According to the exposition by both her and River, ghosts are a group that generally put heavy emphasis on the division between themselves and other communities.
How come we've never heard about this ghost world?
It's a secret because most ghosts are pretty nervous around outsiders.
We learn that for currently unknown reasons, ghosts who live in the ghost world tend to be very distrusting of what River refers to as solids, that being anyone who isn't a ghost, and that most ghosts have never actually encountered anyone from outside of their own society before. This confirms to us that Spectra and the other ghosts at Monster High are explicitly acting in defiance of the values and teachings of their culture, which explains Spectra's nervousness, as well as her respectful performance of formality in the form of her change of clothes. River then asks why Spectra wants to return, and upon learning of Draculaura's haunting, she says that such an event hasn't happened since a ghost called the Red Lady, who apparently used to just scare the shit out of people hundreds of years ago, but because of her actions she was imprisoned and to this day remains locked up, the weight of her crimes eternally affirming the stigma ghosts hold about blurring the lines between the living and the dead. Except there are other undead ghosts. Other undead students at Monster High, so I don't know what they would think of people like Frankie or, most of the students at Monster High, but, whatever. They never address that. We immediately shelve this plot point, waiting for its relevance to be reinstated later on in the narrative, and the characters continue to explore the ghost world, appropriately disguised to avoid drawing attention to themselves. We proceed to follow the ghouls on their journey and subsequent exploration of Monster High's ghost counterpart, Haunted High, and are introduced to several new characters. The first of whom is this camp pirate girl with a high-heeled peg leg, as well as Spectra's friend Kiyomi, this fucking e-boy punk wannabe, and the comically obvious villains, Principal Revenant and her hall monitors. They're all evil because they are the only characters in this movie with slightly different body types. Also, just as a completely unrelated side tangent, I absolutely adore Spectra and Kiyomi's few interactions. We are introduced to her as Spectra's old friend, and she is primarily characterized by Spectra exclaiming over how she used to be far more shy and reserved, but is now surprisingly popular and outspoken. I immediately assumed that this would present some kind of conflict. The trope of a shy, humble, pure female character becoming corrupted by popularity and overconfidence and becoming shallow and selfish is an incredibly prominent trope, unfortunately particularly in media catered to young girls. We often inflict the harmful message on girls and women that confidence and popularity are threatening, this idea often coinciding with the trope of a hyper-feminine mean girl. Because to a patriarchal society, the quiet and reserved girl without much to say is seen as virtuous as opposed to the girl who dares to love herself. In this way, the trope of a high school-age girl who sees herself as unworthy and inferior, developing a sense of overconfidence and arrogance as a negative character arc, communicates to girls that their femininity is dangerous and only acceptable in moderation. Monster High's Haunted refreshingly subverts this by showing Spectra exclusively and unconditionally being happy for her friend, and by clearly telling us that Kiyomi's newfound confidence has had a largely positive effect on her mental health and relationships. Spectra exclusively communicates to her friend and to the audience that Kiyomi is happy with herself, loud about it, and that's a good thing. As well as these fun new characters, the exposition of Haunted High also introduces us to a corrupt legal system and the disproportionate institutional punishments employed as scare tactics to maintain a fascist regime. There are several ghosts flying around that have heavy weighted chains dragging behind them, and River explains that these are ghosts who have committed crimes, and are thus punished by being forcefully employed into doing unpaid labor, and are kept from leaving Haunted High by their detention chains. Additionally, we are shown that protesting or even speaking out in opposition to this jurisprudence is explicitly illegal through a scene where this fucking dickhead paints a temporary anti-establishment mural in protest of unjust incarceration and is thusly allegorically arrested by being given detention. Super subtle, Monster High, thanks. In short, the ghosts at Haunted High live in constant fear of the fantasy high school equivalent of incarceration, and are dictated by this fear, unwilling to protest with their freedom of speech systemically restricted. We can also gather from Spectra's reaction to this that she was unaware of it, and that Ghost Society has become more institutionally corrupt since her last visit. It is here also that I must unfortunately revoke the feminist points I awarded for Kiyomi's introduction, for the fact that Spectra and this grain fuck are immediately established as an obnoxiously heteronormative love interest, for no interesting or significant narrative reason in one of the most egregious examples of comphet in the entire Monster High universe. Yet another addition to the list of times the writers in this film were too cowardly to commit to the pre-established dynamic of unconditional love and care Spectra already shared with Claudine, in favor of a male love interest who swiftly becomes the replacement as Spectra's primary source of emotional support, as well as her creative inspiration, by basically just doing the bare minimum. Claudine, my love, you deserve so much better, and I hope you get a girlfriend who will love and appreciate you as much as you deserve. Anyway, this personification of compulsory heterosexuality and those TikTok POVs where a guy with a perm roleplays his girlfriend being on her period, whose name is apparently Porter Geis, which is a dumbass name even by Monster High standards. I fucking hate this guy so much. Anyway, he gets absolutely got by Principal Revenant's guys and is now a prisoner for, I guess, incentivizing the potential for uprising within the lower class. And Principal Revenant, who is seemingly just there on a ghost Zoom call to watch him suffer, can't blame her honestly, subsequently turns on Spectra and her friends after learning they're from Monster High, previously being unaware that there were even ghosts who defied the strict internally imposed ghost segregation that is the norm at Haunted High. Being made now aware of this breach of the hegemony she devotes her life to reinforcing, Revenant turns once again to a tactic of manipulation and fear-mongering by dramatically removing the ghouls' disguises and exposing them as outsiders to her students. The framing of this reveal is deliberately designed to frighten, to further the narrative that blurring the lines between ghost and monster is a malicious creeping force, tricking and deceiving its way into the familiar, oppressive norm she relies on her subjects not questioning. She controls the ghosts that slave away under her both through fear of her own personal immediate wrath, but also by intricately manufacturing a much deeper fear of the world outside her walls and of any alternative social systems, leaving the oppressed class below her with no hope of anything better than the bare minimum they are awarded under her tyranny, and by forcing them to see her as a protector from the abstract fear of change that she herself created and upholds. Yes, I am implying that the Monster High world is a metaphor for communist society, and yes, I do have trouble making friends, thank you for asking. The ghosts all immediately turn on our girls who try to return to the Monster High and succeed, but not without trapping Spectra in the ghost world. They then immediately decide that with the newly refreshed hatred and vigilance against outsiders at Haunted High, the only way they can go back to set things right is by becoming ghosts themselves. No, that doesn't mean what you think it means. It means drinking magic transformative substance called Boogie Sand that Twyla apparently just has at the ready, that permanently turns someone into whatever species they want and then drink the corresponding mixture with their original forms once Spectra is safe again. Once they all transform, after somehow finding the ghost sand in minutes, despite none of the jars being labelled in any way, we are treated with a brand new doll collection advertisement, followed by the return to Haunted High, where Spectra is being harassed by Porter in his anime fuckboy voice, and it's all very romantic.
Interdimensional internet. I, managed to unblock the portal and did a search.
Okay.
He decides to recruit Spectra to his cause because he believes that her journalism skills would be helpful in protesting against Principal Revenant and her reign of terror. Because Spectra's never been tricked into distributing propaganda with no sources or evidence before. Yeah, she's totally unbiased and wouldn't at all cause problems for your activism, bro. We then cut back to Monster High, where ghost students are literally being kidnapped one by one and forcefully returned to the ghost world, implying that their free will only held up as long as they kept their very existence a secret from the rest of their people. This ultimately confirms that the ghosts at Haunted High are deliberately confined to their own tight-knit ironclad hegemony, and that the only reason any ghost would be exempt from this segregation is that the ghost legal system has failed to recognize their very existence. Revenant does not simply want to keep the students at Haunted High away from the monster world, she explicitly seeks a complete and utter divide between communities that shall not be breached under any circumstances by ghost or monster. Her goal is oppressive organization. According to Revenant's policies, things like personal identity, personal choice, goals and aspirations, and political ideation are irrelevant to a ghost's place in the artificial ecosystem, and their position should be exclusively dictated by the circumstances of their birth and their immutable physical characteristics. This is reflective of a mind that very much fears the complexity of identity, favoring an approach that, while oppressive and unethical, makes sense to the way she personally finds it comforting to perceive the world. Revenant fears the entropy of free will and stubbornly refuses to renovate her systems of power in order to accommodate the intricacies inherent to the capacity for complex thought. In other words, she's homophobic as well as racist. Despite her attempts, there do seem to be a decent amount of ghosts that recognize the injustice present in her beliefs. Haunted High students are afraid of what lies beyond the threshold of their oppression, but they are simultaneously aware that the conditions they live under are unethical, and they're more willing to give rebels a chance than Revenant would like. Kiyomi assists the main ghouls with their infiltration mission by helping them get used to ghost physics, and Spectra and Porter try to dig up dirt on Principal Revenant while she's distracted with the new ghost she kidnapped from Monster High. Spectra is also now passionately fixated on her new era of ethical journalism, and has become a devoted spokesperson against the dangers of rumors and gossip, vowing to never again publish malicious propaganda.
Gossip is garbage! You have no idea what you're talking about! None of that is true! Those are just dumb rumors!
While the fact that she needed to be lectured by her black friend about why racism is bad in order to reach this conclusion is unfortunate, it's not entirely unrealistic, and at the very least plays heavily into her overall arc across the movie, that being her journey towards socialist radicalization. Maybe she and Porter can fix each other. Despite the brewing tensions and growing push for revolution amongst the ghosts, many still remain hesitant to protest Revenant's rule. And in order to maintain her authority and combat the efforts of the small number of active protesters, she and her brute force intimidation squad are doubling down on the fascist regime through mass incarceration. She singles out and interrogates the main ghouls upon realizing who they are and being made aware of how they were able to exploit a loophole in her shallow worldview, which she assumedly sees as a challenge against her authority, and decides her best bet is to become a full-on white supremacy allegory and use whatever it is that turned these 5 monsters into ghosts on the entire monster world, expanding her quest for hegemony to the most extreme degree and making it clear to the audience that segregation was only the first step in her long-term plan of what can be unfortunately seen as ghost race purification. So at this point, our villain is not only a bully, but also both allegorically and blatantly racist and homophobic, as well as a fascist dictator and a full-blown eugenicist. I feel like we don't discuss how insane animated kids movies with shallow political commentary are enough, because what the fuck, Monster High? The activist ghosts who've sided with the Monster High students, including River and Vandala, which, good for them, make a run for it so as to avoid imprisonment and hide in Porter's safe house, which is just a room in the school that somehow only he knows about. While speculating about Revenant's new eugenicist era, Kiyomi drops an absolute bombshell by offhandedly mentioning Boogie Sand, despite none of the ghouls telling her that's what they use to transform, which makes Draculaura realize that Kiyomi has been the one haunting her, and traveling back and forth between the monster and ghost world. Intrigue. She explains that she never intended to scare Draculaura or even be noticed, but that she was enamored with the freedom of expression and diversity at Monster High, and admired the students there. This is where the queer reading of this story becomes especially relevant, as Kiyomi explains that she felt trapped at Haunted High and didn't fit in with the strict expectations in the ghost world, and found the subversion of these values that Monster High represented by having such diverse students to be empowering.
I wasn't trying to haunt you or scare you. I just love what I see at Monster High. You all are so cool with your freaky flaws, so nice to each other. I used to be so shy, but spending time with you ghouls at Monster High, I don't know, made me feel more colorful.
Although we never see Kiyomi's old self before she began these expeditions, we understand that her mental health was considerably worse, and that she was incredibly shy and afraid of expressing herself. The reveal that she is Draculaura's ghost leads us to conclude that the improved self-confidence and subsequent popularity referenced by Spectra directly correlates with her defiance of the conservative values she grew up with in the ghost world, and her exposure to other people like her through her exploration of Monster High. In this way, the rejection of the strict binarism enforced at Haunted High between monsters and ghosts in favor of blurring the lines between identities and finding solidarity within subversive counterculture can be seen as a direct metaphor for coming out and finding safety within the queer community for the first time. And although the racism allegory in this movie is beyond flawed, as many narratives attempting to tackle racism through fantasy often are, I find the queer subtext and narrative is one that actually holds up and is genuinely pretty on point. It's not perfect, but it's a reasonably accurate representation of a queer experience, presented in a way that can be easily understood and identified with by children, and it explicitly emphasizes the positives that come with discovering one's queer identity, instead of hyper-focusing on homophobia and discrimination. Draculaura forgives Kiyomi and reassures her that the conflict that resulted from her trips to Monster High wasn't her fault, but the fault of the social system and the Goat's world, Revenant's closed-mindedness, etc. This incentivizes Spectra to decide that she will attempt to confront Principal Revenant in person.
This has to stop. I'm going to go talk to her. Already have detention chains. How could it get any worse?
I could lose you.
Symbolizing disrespect to her position as an authority figure by approaching her face-to-face instead of fighting against the systems she orchestrates remotely. Obviously a commentary on privilege and the upper class and the idea of sitting in one's ivory tower while others carry out the dirty work to keep you there. Spectra approaches the door to Principal Revenant's office and begins to write down the evil villain monologue very loudly coming through the door, presumably in order to publish it to her fellow punks. She's quickly busted though, and once finally brought face to face with her, Spectra realizes that Principal Revenant herself is restrained by a comically large coiled mass of the very chains she has been inflicting on her students for years, explaining why she only ever interacts with students remotely with her ghost magic. The implication being that she bore the chains first and is attempting to alleviate herself of them by passing them on to others. This is confirmed when Porter busts through and tries to distract her so Spectra can escape, and she restrains him with one of her own chains. Back in the safe room, bunker, room. Anyway, back in the place, Kiyomi is explaining to Draculaura about how she is able to open temporary gateways between the monster and ghost world, which is the same method supposedly used by the Red Lady years before.
I don't know, some kind of energy. And some ghosts can use that energy to open little windows between the worlds.
Before this can go anywhere though, Revenant's goons bust down the door and restrain everyone because Porter was a little bitch and told her where they were, seemingly in under a minute. Reasonably, Spectra is pretty pissed and dumps his ass. I wish it ended that way, but obviously this is going to be a misdirection since a male love interest is mandatory for some reason. After capturing the few ghosts with an evolved understanding of social nuance, Principal Revenant continues broadcasting anti-solid propaganda to the rest of the school, using the Monster High students' infiltration to support her narrative by framing them as malicious invaders.
You must have heard gossip that intruders from the monster world have viciously attempted to invade our beloved school. Well, I'm here to tell you that these rumors are absolutely true. They've come to frighten us, to haunt us, to destroy our ghostly way of life.
Parallels are pointedly drawn between this and the story Spectra published on werewolves at the beginning of the film, still emphasizing the dangers of misinformation as one of the main themes. Which at the very least is a better direction for the film to take than trying to cover fucking eugenics. Specifically, she uses the phrase, "destroy our way of life," in reference to the ghouls, which is significant as it pretty accurately parallels most generally anti-diversification talking points in the real world that bigots use. The idea that monsters will corrupt the pristine traditions and ideals of ghost society definitely feels like something in the same vein as an argument that a real white supremacist or homophobic, transphobic, generally bigoted person would make, and it's probably where the movie comes closest to dealing with the racism analogy well. That's not saying much, though. After this, Revenant returns to interrogating the ghouls and finds out from the extensive notes Claudine has been taking the whole time on the previous events of the movie that she intended to give to Spectra as a potential story. Another example of why she is the obvious choice for love interest, but whatever.
I'm trying to write down everything that happens for Spectra. This is gonna make a great story for her blog.
Anyway, yeah, she finds them, and she finds out how they all turned into ghosts, and is like, oh, sick, okay, I'm gonna go ghostify everyone left at Monster High because I'm comically evil. After she leaves to go be an offensively bad Nazi analogy or whatever the fuck villains do in kids' movies off-screen, Spectra and her friends go off to find Porter and kick his ass for selling them out and being a poser. Before they can have a full good-for-her moment, however, he concludes the misdirection and makes it up to them by revealing that he stole the key to their chains and transfers them all to himself, having seen Revenant do the same thing earlier and now understanding how they work, and I still don't trust him. He also surprises Spectra by revealing that he has restored the old writing desk in his safe house room for her to use, which, as much as I hate him, is very cute and both represents his character development and newfound willingness to lean into her interests, despite not sharing them, and gives me hope that she might be able to fix him after all. The ghouls then set to work removing the detention chains from all the other students and transferring them to Porter because fuck him still, yeah, I still hate him. Vanilla then goes to return the Ghost Monster High students back to the monster world on her ship, but not before Spectra finds it necessary to potentially jeopardize their whole mission by going to visit Porter. Girl, he's not that special, I promise you can text him later. Spectra is hesitant to leave even after this though, as she still feels an obligation to help the remaining Haunted High students. After all, the status quo has been re-established, but Haunted High remains the corrupt and oppressive environment it was at the beginning of the story, and the anti-solid narratives Revenant has always perpetuated have new weight that she is able to use to further manipulating the ghosts down her personal anti-monster radicalization pipeline. Spectra seems to be under the impression that she should try and deal with the issues in the ghost world at the source, rather than following her friend's plan of just preventing the immediate efforts of Revenant's goons. She's gained an idea of how systemic injustice works. Good for her. But never mind actually, because immediately after this she returns to Vandalla's ship and they carry on with their original plan, with the additional information that the Hall Monitors are actively carrying out their ghostification mission. So I guess more wide-scale activism is theoretical and will come later after the immediate threat to innocent people has been eliminated. She's developed a respect for strategic militancy and preservative priority in her protests. Good for her. This is where Spectra finally connects the dots and realizes that Principal Revenant is the Red Lady, and her detention chains come from her own past crimes. So either she is a shallow hypocrite willing to become a lifelong advocate for the systems she previously rebelled against in order to free herself, or she is burdened by internalized shame and confusion around her complex relationship with the monster world, and is compensating by targeting others who are more open about sharing her desires. Again, she's homophobic. This revelation is clearly of more significance to Spectra than the other ghouls, as she immediately goes back to Haunted High again, while the rest of her friends speedrun the journey through one of Kiyomi's gateways back to Monster High. As the Hall Monitors invade the monster world, Spectra uses her knack for publishing malicious propaganda for good this time, outing Principal Revenant as being the Red Lady and destroying her reputation, which greatly impacts her influence over the students and forces them to finally question her as a leader, as well as the values she advocates. Revenant's image is everything when it comes to maintaining her position of power, and her manipulation is the very thing that makes her vulnerable. An epic finale confrontation takes place, ending with all the ghouls still in their ghost forms back at Monster High, combining their powers to make a gateway big enough to send the ghost ship and the Hall Monitors back to the ghost world, in time to block Principal Revenant from transferring all her detention chains to Spectra. Look the fuck out, The Matrix! There's a new contender for most iconic action scene of all time. The Red Lady doesn't give a shit either way though, she's free and thus has achieved her goal. Before she can escape, however, the detention chains she has passed on renew themselves, and she is once again restrained. She tries to blame the Monster High students, turning on each one of them for an explanation, but she is cut off when Spectra tells her that she is the one creating the very chains that bind her.
Who is doing this to me?
You're doing it to yourself.
The chains are representative of her lies and hypocrisy, and a physical manifestation of the consequences she inflicted on her psyche by inflicting her shame onto others in an attempt to escape it herself. She is a person whose suffering comes directly from her avoidance of the truth, and the moral is clearly that taking out your own internal struggles with guilt and shame on those who have a healthier relationship with whatever it is you're ashamed of does not alleviate your pain, and instead simply adds more guilt and shame and buries you further in your own elaborate delusions of righteousness.
Look around at your students. All those chains you've given out, and yet you weren't getting any closer to freedom. You were creating more chains for yourself. You've been to the monster world. You know the rumors you were spreading aren't true. The solids are not out to get you. They're just like you and me.
The Red Lady's story is about a queer person, confined to their own internalized homophobia, and an exploration of the stubborn unwillingness to be genuine that a person can develop in a world where their interests and feelings are stigmatized. If the ghost world did not hold such an aversion towards mingling with monsters, her relationship with the monster world likely wouldn't have been this unhealthy and malicious in the first place, and her subconscious wouldn't have felt the need to punish her for her actions, and no one would have been harmed by her. This story explores how the evils of an individual are informed by the values of their culture, and teaches us that shame is far more dangerous in the long term than unapologetic truth. The movie ends with the Red Lady coming to understand that trying to escape her shame by hurting people will never let her conscience be free, and promising to make it up to the world and herself by not being racist anymore and hopefully going to therapy. We never actually hear about what happens in wider ghost society after these events, but with the young generation of ghosts turned to gay socialism by Spectra's blog, we can at least hope that changes will be made on a larger scale with time and work, and the students of Haunted High are now free to travel between realms and explore the world without punishment. There's no conclusion. That was it. That's the video.
To play like a monster.